Welcome to Infection and Immunity Evidence Explained, a Doherty Institute podcast. I'm Rebecca Elliott. On Monday, Doherty Clinical Trials Ltd, Australia's first purpose-built facility specifically commissioned to deliver volunteer infection studies, was officially opened by the Victorian Minister for Medical Research, the Honourable Ben Carroll MP. As a not-for-profit registered charity and subsidiary of the University of Melbourne, Doherty Clinical Trials has been established by the Doherty Institute to accelerate the development of novel medicines and vaccines through bespoke early-phase clinical trials. Here to tell us more about Doherty Clinical Trials is Director of the Doherty Institute, Professor Sharon Lewin, and Chief Medical Officer of the facility, Professor James McCarthy. No stranger to the podcast, Sharon is a world-leading infectious diseases expert. As an infectious diseases physician and basic scientist, her laboratory focuses on basic, translational and clinical research aimed at finding a cure for HIV and understanding the interaction between HIV and hepatitis B virus. She is a board member for Doherty Clinical Trials. And making his podcast debut, along with his role at Doherty Clinical Trials, James is the Director of the Royal Melbourne Hospital's Victorian Infectious Diseases Service and a Professor of Medicine at the Doherty Institute. His research has focused on the diagnosis and treatment of parasitic diseases, and most recently on the development and application of clinical trial systems, including volunteer infection studies. Sharon and James, thank you so much for joining me on Infection and Immunity Evidence Explained.
Thanks, Rebecca. Great to be here.
Now let's start with you, Sharon. How did the idea for Doherty Clinical Trials come about?
Well, the idea for this facility started actually in 2016, where we were very keen to establish volunteer infection studies for influenza. This was a phenomenon that we were following for other pathogens around the world. So a way of giving a person an infection in a very safe and controlled way to understand the infection, then also understand interventions. But we found that this was complicated. It needed a specialised facility. It needed expertise in the area, and it needed actually quite a bit of funding to establish the clinical trial unit. Along the way, I met James McCarthy, who was interested in establishing expertise around the country in volunteer infection studies. And we actually had a grant together in around 2018, if I have that right, 2017, because we wanted to do flu challenge work, and James, of course, is an expert in malaria work. We didn't get the grant, but we did get James McCarthy to come down to Melbourne, and James moved down in 2020, so we suddenly had a world expert in this, which was an incredible bonus. We could never have done it without James. And the next challenge was finding the facility, and this needs specialised facilities, so we would have had to renovate any place we were looking at. We looked at hotels, we looked at apartment blocks, we looked at hospitals, and then we landed on the facility in East Melbourne, but needed considerable money to do it. And so we actually did get considerable funding through the pandemic from philanthropists and also the Victorian government, and that's what's allowed us to build this new facility in East Melbourne at the old Peter MacCallum Hospital.
And it's looking absolutely fantastic. But tell me, how does it differ to other clinical trial facilities?
Well, this is the first dedicated volunteer infection study clinical trial unit in Australia, purpose-built for these studies. The clinical trial unit will also do other phase 1 trials, but its really main focus is on volunteer infection studies, and specifically in organisms that need specialised containment. So if you challenge or give a volunteer an infection with a respiratory pathogen, they have the potential to be infectious, so therefore this all has to be done in a specialised containment unit, which has negative pressure. So this is the first time we could do these studies in Australia, specifically with influenza or other respiratory pathogens. We know they are being done, of course, in the US and in the UK and in some countries in Europe, but this will be the first that's possible to do in Australia.
That's really exciting. Can you tell me a little bit more about this current facility?
So the current facility has 25 beds. It is a not-for-profit, wholly owned subsidiary from the University of Melbourne, but funded and overseen by the Doherty Institute. So it will run as an independent company, essentially. We have a board that oversees Doherty Clinical Trials, chaired by Deborah Rathjen, who's an outstanding immunologist with tremendous experience in startups and biotech. I'm a member of the board, as is Russell Basser, Terry Hurst and Andrea Fisher and Alan Tate. The 25-bed facility will start phase 1 clinical trials with either volunteer infection studies or also other studies, pharmacokinetics, dynamics for new drugs. Our focus is on infectious diseases. We're going to stick to that, but there's plenty of work to be done in new vaccines and new therapeutics, as well as in the setting of volunteer infection studies.
James, we better get on to that subject. What is a volunteer infection study?
So it's a study where healthy people who don't have an infection are experimentally infected with a virus or a bacteria or some other sort of pathogen. And then we do that under very controlled circumstances. So we monitor their safety, their health, and also their response to a vaccine or a drug. So in the case of a vaccine, we might take 2 groups of people, one group given a vaccine, one group given a placebo, and we would give both groups of people a virus, for example, influenza. And then if our vaccine works, the people who've been given the vaccine before they get given influenza, they won't get sick, they won't get influenza, so we know the vaccine works. So that's a really powerful way to get a really quick read on whether or not your vaccine works or not. And one of our big problems is we've got lots and lots of candidate vaccines, and we need to know which ones we're going to take into later stages of development. So this is a great tool to actually get that early information about whether your drug or your vaccine works against the organism that you're developing it for.
So why are these particular studies important to get that information?
Well, because they're faster and they cost a lot less money than doing a field study. So, for example, if you look for a disease that infects children and pregnant women, such as malaria, to do those studies in tropical Africa takes a long time, it's difficult to do, and there are lots and lots of reasons why it's really difficult to control those infections. Whereas here in Melbourne, we can do that same study in healthy young adults and watch those people with all of the controls in place by monitoring the level of infection as we follow the course of their infection and give them curative treatment before they get sick.
Now, James, this is your first foray onto the podcast, as I mentioned in the introduction. Can you tell me a little bit about your background in this type of study?
Like Sharon, I trained as an infectious diseases physician, and then I suppose I became interested in clinical research. That is how we understand human illness, by studying humans rather than experimental animals. And back about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to lead the development of studies in Queensland to adapt a model that had been studied for many years for malaria to test malaria drugs. And this was done in conjunction with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Medicines for Malaria. So over that period of time, we tested more than a dozen drugs and undertook more than 20 studies where we were really able to change the landscape of how one develops drugs for malaria using these volunteer infection studies. And that gave me a deep understanding of all aspects of how you do these studies, from how you make the material you infect people with, how you make sure people are safe, how you get ethics approval, how you get funding for this, how you report the results, and basically end-to-end management of these studies is actually quite a complicated business. So I had the experience of learning how to do that and leading quite a large team to implement those, not only for malaria, but working with Professor Andrew Steer at MCRI on Strep A, which is a terrible cause of rheumatic heart disease in our Indigenous populations, and as well with hookworm with partners at James Cook University.
Now, can you run me through how a volunteer infection study actually works? What if I was someone coming in, a volunteer, what would be the process that would be undertaken?
So first of all, it's obviously important to explain to the volunteer what we're going to do and explain to them what they are signing up for, and to make sure that they have informed consent to do what they do. So they need to understand what's happening, and they need to agree to participate in the study. So that's an important issue. Secondly, we need to make sure that whatever we're giving to them is extremely safe. So we do a lot of characterisation of the virus or the bacteria or the parasite before we give it to them, to know that what's in the bottle is what's on the label, so to speak. And then we need to have a means by which to monitor them so they stay safe through the study and that they don't transmit the pathogen to someone else, and that at the end of the study they're cured of their infection and no one else has contracted it from them.
Now, my number one question would be, if I was a volunteer, is how do you ensure my safety and what are the ethics behind these trials? Sharon, can you touch on that?
Well, for any clinical trial that's done globally, especially in Australia, there was approval and assessment of the trial by an ethics committee, and they will determine the ethics or the appropriateness of the clinical trial design, the question being asked, and whether the team can do the work that's proposed. There are other checks and balances, though, in Australia, and that is we also have an overarching regulatory framework that looks very carefully at clinical trials, particularly for phase 1 studies. So phase 1 studies, first in human studies. So no one has received this drug or vaccine before. So there are inherent safety issues about first in human studies. And so there's a national regulatory framework that oversees this as well. Having said that, this is all new stuff for most people, and I think there's a tremendous amount of social science that we should be doing in understanding the volunteers' expectations of these studies, their understanding of the language that we're using. It's a very rich environment. We're, of course, not the first to do this. James just mentioned he's done many, many similar studies in Queensland, but we hope to develop a community of supportive volunteers who understand what we're doing, are increasingly literate with why we're doing it, and will participate in some of these exciting trials that really will be able to move vaccines and therapeutics into the clinic way more quickly than we could currently do using conventional clinical trial pathways.
We know that hundreds of millions of people every year get malaria and influenza, so we know a lot about the features of malaria and influenza, to use those as examples. And therefore, in my mind, to give someone malaria or influenza when we know about it is actually safer than a first-in-human study with a drug or something that's never been in humans before, because we really don't know until we apply it to humans. So I think in lots of ways these volunteer infection studies are actually safer than a first-in-human study, and certainly for a family member of mine, where I know what the outcomes are going to be, is better than if I don't know.
So, James, what sort of people do participate in these sorts of studies?
These studies require a lot of commitment. So in my malaria studies, people need to be available for a whole month. So they need to be able to come in and out every day. They need to be able to get a blood test very frequently, often every day, every second day. They need to be able to stay in the clinical trials unit, that is Doherty Clinical Trials, for 3 or 4 days. So that's a commitment that most people with a full-time job or caring for a family can't make. So we need to recognise that these people are giving up a lot of their time. So we're compensating them for their time, not for their risk. So it's not like we're paying somebody to get more, somebody to be paid more if they get a more dangerous pathogen. So we're really saying, well, look, the hourly minimum wage is, let's say for argument, $20 an hour. So we need to make sure that if people are giving up their time, we pay them at least what they're paid on an hourly basis, so that their time is compensated for and their inconvenience is compensated for.
Great. Now, we're fresh from a tour of the facility this morning, so if you could describe what it was like sort of being in there to our audience, and what they might expect from if they were to participate in a trial.
So, I mean, I think we're quite proud of our facility. It's got a modern sunlit feature. It looks a little bit like a hospital, but the beds are more comfortable. It's got amenity that some of our volunteers in the first study we did felt it was like a holiday resort, because it's not in any way unpleasant to look at, and we've done our best to make it a convenient location, because people in some of our studies, people will be staying there for a week, so we need to make sure that they've got a games room, that the food's going to be nice, that they've got privacy, that we're going to respect everything they need to have in order to have their experience being a favourable one.
So can you tell me about some of the upcoming trials that we have planned?
So we've got quite a number of trials in the planning stage. As Sharon has said, we are going to be doing studies with vaccines that don't involve infection. So we may be doing some studies looking at, for example, influenza, where there are a number of influenza vaccines coming available. And now with mRNA technologies, there's a real explosion of vaccines that we need to test. So we will be doing some of those studies. We've actually got 4 studies coming up related to the volunteer infection studies, the first being a malaria study with a genetically modified malaria parasite. So we've actually modified that parasite to change how it grows in humans. We've got a study of influenza using a virus that was first tested in the United States 18 months ago. So we'll be doing that study hopefully this year. We've also got a study in planning. Many of the audience will know about Buruli ulcer that we're seeing more and more around Melbourne. So we're actually currently manufacturing the bacteria that causes Buruli ulcer because we think there's lots of good things to do in terms of vaccines and drugs to treat Buruli, as well as understanding how it spreads. So we're doing that. We've also got money from the Medicines Research Future Fund to actually develop a challenge model for Neisseria gonorrhoeae, the cause of gonorrhoea, where we'll be applying the bacteria to the throat of healthy volunteers and testing drugs and vaccines for gonorrhoea using that model. And then I'm sure there are others that are coming up. The other one is the Strep A vaccine study with Andrew Steer from MCRI. So we've got a pretty good pipeline of studies to go ahead, and the challenge for us is to get all those into the clinic and get all the approvals we need and run those studies successfully, because we think there's a wonderful opportunity to make Melbourne even more world famous for its infectious diseases research.
Yeah, it's great to see such a healthy pipeline of trials coming up, and call out to any healthy volunteers who would like to participate. Sharon, so as we've discussed, the facility is currently a temporary one in the old Peter Mac building in East Melbourne, and it will eventually be housed in the Australian Institute for Infectious Disease. How is it progressing?
Well, things are going gangbusters for the AIID. This is a joint venture between the Doherty Institute, University of Melbourne and the Burnet Institute. We're building a new facility and immediately adjacent to the Doherty Institute, but the building will be double the size. $650 million facility, $400 million of that has been funded by the Victorian government. And the Doherty Clinical Trials Unit will have a home in the AIID. So where are we with the AIID? We've got very advanced designs of what it will look like, and just a sneak peek, it will really look stunning. Absolutely beautiful building. John Wardle is the architect who's done lots of fabulous buildings around Melbourne. And we have had to compulsorily acquire 2 existing buildings, which are kind of miserable-looking 1970s buildings that sit right next to the Doherty. They've actually been emptied now, and they will be pulled down over the course of the year, and we can start building our lovely new AIID. We're hoping by the end of the year. The estimated time for completion is 2027.
Thank you so much for your time today, Sharon and James. Congratulations on the launch of Doherty Clinical Trials, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks, Rebecca.
For more information about Doherty Clinical Trials, and if you'd like to register your interest to participate in a future trial, visit dohertyclinicaltrials.com. That's dohertyclinicaltrials.com. If there is a specific topic you would like us to cover, please get in touch with us by emailing doherty-media@unimelb.edu.au. That's doherty-media@unimelb.edu.au. If you've enjoyed our podcast, please rate and review on your favourite podcasting app, and subscribe if you haven't already. The Doherty Institute is a joint venture between the University of Melbourne and the Royal Melbourne Hospital. See you next time.